It's time to knit our sleeves, and before we do, let's take a look at the proportion and design of the whole thing. Here's the sweater that we've knitted so far, no sleeve. Here's what we'll be adding. The shape of this sleeve actually is this. And this is a fold line that goes down the outside of the arm. So this is the front armhole, and this piece of the sleeve slides into or adjoins the back armhole, same position here. So we get this triangle without a point at the bottom. Before you begin, double check that everything's going to fit together, because if we had any gauge inequities, it could be a problem. So it's always best to double check right now and decide. My armhole is 3 inches deep, which means actually I want the top of my sleeve to be 6 inches. I don't know if you could see all of that very well, so I'm going to go over it again. 3-inch deep armhole, but there'll be a fold here at the shoulder line. This is the other point of the sleeve that goes to the underarm. We'll be knitting going into our sleeve shape. So my top edge needs to be 6 inches wide. There also needs to be room for a seam, and generally 1 stitch is allowed for the seam. So I've double checked that my numbers are going to come out correct. Here's how to double check that your numbers are going to come out correct. Let's use a different set of numbers, both for practice and because of the fact that most of your armholes will be bigger than mine. If yours is 4 inches deep, multiply it, or whatever size it is, by 2, and that's an 8-inch total. The top width of the sleeve should be 8 inches, but that is when it's finished. 4 stitches times 8 inches means you need 32 stitches. However, in order to get this sleeve finished, you will need to seam it at the underarm. So generally we allow 1 whole column of stitches on each side, a total of 2 stitches, and that would mean that 34 is what you should cast on. If you are ending up with a substantially different amount than this of sleeve stitches, or your armhole is not matching up, you may want to adjust. It's actually pretty simple math. It's a little bit hard to explain on a basic video. So if it's not simple to you, just get in touch with me, tell me what's going on, and we'll work through it together privately. It does happen that if your gauge and armhole depth are not quite what you expected, you may multiply this out and say, oh, well, the next size up comes out about like that, and be able to substitute the next size. That's an easy option, and it often does work. But if you need help, I'm always here. Email me with as much info as you can, and we'll get through it. So for my sleeve, I've discovered that I need to cast on 24 stitches. If you've been paying super close attention, you will be saying, why aren't you casting on 26 stitches? Because you said you need a 6-inch sleeve, and you have a 4 stitches per inch gauge. So it should be 6 times 4, which is 24, but I think you forgot your plus 2 for the seam. And I didn't. Once I double and triple checked, I actually got slightly looser stitches than 4 per inch, just slightly. But I have assessed that I don't need those 2 stitches after all. That's what you're looking at, is me adjusting as I go, just as you might have to. Now there are 2 ways to knit a sleeve. One is from the cuff up, moving that way, and one is from the top down. You may actually use my pattern and most patterns to go either direction. Let me explain how that works. First of all, the reason I would like to start top down is that it's easier for most loom knitters to make tidy decreases than tidy increases. And that's what we'll be doing if we start at the wide point and work this direction. Let's learn to read these decreasing instructions first. Decrease every fourth row 2 times. E is usually for every in a pattern abbreviation. Fourth is obviously fourth. It could be sixth, 10th, third, anything. This is 2 times, could be 5 times, could be any number. So I'm going to actually knit 4 rows straight down and decrease. I will do that on both sides because sleeves are normally symmetrical. They certainly are in this kind of pattern. So generally you keep the decreases even, and this means 1 on each side when you read these instructions. Then since I'm doing that same thing 2 times, I will knit 4 more straight rows and decrease. Next instruction, every 6th row 1x, 1 time. So we knit 6 straight rows and work a decrease. Then work to row 18 and decrease 1 more time. Your size may not have a final decrease. This is because of it being in infant size. Your decrease may be 2, 3, or 4 rows away from the last row. Don't worry about that, just follow the instructions. And then I'm going to knit 5 rows of rib because this is a tiny sweater. If it were a sweater for me, I would want more like between 2 and 6 inches of ribbing. One way to adjust the length if you're not positive how long somebody's arms are is to be generous with the ribbing. And for an adult, you almost always want 3 or 4 inches, but you can knit more and then they can turn up a cuff or extend it depending on the weather, what they're wearing underneath, and if they are youngsters, if they grew. So then we will do a neat bind off, and that's another nice thing about top down is that this is your final edge and we can do very neat bind offs. We have lots of practice doing that. However, the same design would read this way, going the other way. Cast on, and you may need to figure out how many stitches to cast on. If I did the math, I can tell you I would cast on 16. Knit the ribbing, increase immediately, 1 on each side, and then reverse the instructions. This one here, row 18, is my final decrease, so it doesn't tell me where this is, but we can extrapolate it from the original instructions. If this is row 4, then this is row 8, plus 6, this is row 14. No big deal. So we would knit, let's see, since 18 is the total, there are 4 more rows. So we would knit 4 and increase, knit 8 and increase, knit 4 and increase, and knit 4 and then bind off. See how that works? You can get the same shape going up or going down. All that should make you ready to actually knit, so let's do. By the way, if by chance you were unable to get all your yarn in the same dye lot, this is the place to change dye lots. Don't do it on the back of the sweater or the front. Do it when you change to the sleeves. Because of the angle that they are to the body, the light catches them differently, and that fact will tend to hide the faint difference in color that's possible in a dye lot change. I'm going to use the same cast on that we've been using and double E-wrap and cast on my 24 stitches. Whoops, split that one, but it's easily fixed. So you cast on your number of stitches. It does not matter here whether you start from the left or start from the right. We will be knitting what's called a flat panel on the loom, so we'll be working going left and going right alternately, and it doesn't really matter where you begin. So let's all get these cast on, and I'll meet you at the end of the row. I have all my stitches cast on, and you have all of yours. So let's start back doing the Kiss U wrap, but notice that wherever you expect to have a seam, as we do in the edges of the sleeve, the two edges of the sleeve will become a seam that goes on the underneath side of the arm. And on those occasions, we normally do not want to slip the edge stitch because we need it to do our seaming. So let's all knit in my case, our first 4 rows, but whatever you need to knit prior to the first decrease. Knit those rows without slipping edge stitches. Knit every stitch, in other words, and we will get back together when they're done. I've knitted the rows necessary to do my first decrease. So let's talk about that. Yours may be a different number of rows than mine, but you should be ready. Now, here's a simple decrease. Obviously, the work just got a stitch smaller, and we would do that on both sides. However, I don't recommend it. Remember that we're going to want to seam these edges, and when seaming, we often stitch right next to the first column of stitches, which isn't a clear and distinct thing if you decrease with the simple decrease. Here's what to do instead. This is called a full fashion decrease. Occasionally I've seen somebody call it an inside decrease, which is sort of logical. It's inside the work, not on the edge. Now we have the same net result, but we will have a continuous vertical column of stitches at the edge so that we can stitch into that area and get an easy, neat seam. So this time, when we begin knitting across, the doubled stitch will be 1 stitch to the inside of the work. It's not a huge big deal, but it's no harder to do. You might as well, because it makes for a neater, easier seam. So let me do that on the other side. And I've got 4 more rows to knit before my next decrease. You may have a different number, but every time that we go to decrease all the way around down the sweater, this is what we do. Knit a certain number of rows, work the decrease, then begin to knit again, remembering to knit that end stitch to create a complete column of stitches so as to facilitate a tidy seam. So actually we're all ready to just follow our decreasing rhythm as given by whichever pattern you're using. Work down, and I will meet you at the wrist when we're ready for ribbing. Here we go. I have finished my little sleeve, at least all the main part of it, and I'm holding it out so you can maybe see the decreasing. See it getting narrower? Now it's time to do our ribbing, and I've decided on knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. It can be either knit 1, purl 1, or knit 2, purl 2. And we'll go round and round, not round and round, back and forth, doing knit 2, purl 2. I'm only doing 5 or 6 rows for this little bitty sweater, and you do whichever seems suitable for your sweater, and then we'll get together and bind off. When you've finished your ribbing, bind off using the transfer bind off that we've been using, or any bind off that's attractive enough and stretchy enough in your eyes, and your sleeve will be done. It will be time to make the second sleeve. So here's my little sleeve. I've got my loom holding the top edge of it so you can see how it got decreased all the way down. And there's my ribbed edge. When you clip this yarn tail after binding off, leave it long like I have, as I have, and pull it through the final stitch. Doing that will give you something to use to stitch the edges of the seam together and get one yarn tail out of the way. because this will now run up the seam. It'll end at the underarm, and we won't have to weave it in down here. It'll all be nice and tidy. So make your second sleeve. I'll make mine, and then we'll do that.